Why is the Porsche 996 so cheap? You look around all over the classifieds and you can't find yourself a 997 generation for anything less than $50,000, $60,000, and yet the generation just one older, the 996, which I'm driving in today, is extraordinarily cheap. What's going on? I mean, you can have these cars for as little as $20,000, $25,000, and actually, many of them are actually in superb condition. But there's some fear. There's certainly some fear mongering. There's also some valid reasons why they're cheaper. And I'm going to break this down why, in fact, the Porsche 996 911 is so cheap on the used car market. We've got ourselves a 2001 Porsche 996. This is a Carrera Cabriolet. As you can tell, you can see the plastic window back there. And it's a lovely car to drive. You know, rear-wheel drive, it's spirited. You know, if you really push it, you can probably get a little oversteer in the corners. It's a fun car. It's great for autocrossing. In a lot of ways, from the driver's perspective here, it feels every bit as good as anything newer. 997, even the early generation 991s before they went to turbos. Other than, of course, the 991s, they bumped up the interior. They put a little bit more of that brushed, you know, aluminum, and, you know, they sort of modernized it, if you will. But the 997 was the first generation way back in 1998 or 99 thereabouts, where they popped out with this new water-cooled combination, water-cooled, oil cooling, air-cooled, the whole 9 yards, all wrapped up into one. You know, the 993 generation, 911 before this, is an absolute gem. And a lot of people love those cars. They're skyrocketing in value. But coincidentally, the 997s, the generation after this car here, the 996, are also creeping up in value. So what's going on? Why isn't the 996 going up in value? Or is it? Well, we want to talk about that a little bit, because as you scour the classifieds, you know, we were looking for one of these cars a couple of years ago, and we didn't want to spend a ton of money, but we knew there was some, you know, there was some generational, there was some improvements over the years. There were some reasons why a lot of people didn't want to get into a 996, hence the prices dropped and they stayed low. And they almost continue to stay low up until very recently. See, because what's starting to happen now is the prices of all other 911s is going up so much, so quickly, that now what you've got is a situation where there's nothing much else on the market unless you're willing to spend 60,000, 50, 60, or 70,000 or beyond. I'm just gonna crank this up here. It's a little bit noisy out there. And so the 996 has a certain value proposition to it that just feels so right. And while many people are hating on the 996, in fact, there are some very specific models that are really going up in value. And I want to explain those too in a second here, because this naturally aspirated 996 I'm looking at, I'm driving right now, it's a 3.4 liter, about 296 horsepower. They run a 5-chain timing chain system, and there was a pile of issues. You know, later on they came up with a 3.6 liter, so after 2002 they popped out on the other side with a 3.6, bumped up the ponies a wee bit, and all of this in what they call the M96 engine. This is a flat 6, and there's been small enhancements along the way, but when this car came out, it wasn't really loved. It never really received the love that previous generation 911s like the 993 got. A lot of it was because it was such a drastic change. They went from air-cooled all the way to this liquid-cooled, and this was the first model that did that. This was the first model that bridged the old school to the new school. And see, part of that's part of the problem. Herein lies, this is the car that was blazing the trail for what we know today, which is liquid cooling, and of course the requirement of liquid cooling to advance the power outputs, because they were hitting the thermal limits on the air-cooled cars. There was only so much power you could put down. You couldn't properly cool the heads, and ultimately detonation and thermal limits were pretty much vastly encroached upon. But then it comes along the 996. You know, it's many would argue that it's not really the proper 911. The M96 engine, again, all these extra timing chains, extra problems, a whole new redesign. It's modular engine. It doesn't even have a proper dry sump engine. They have now what they call the integrated dry sump. The integrated dry sump means it's all combined. It's more of what you'll find in some, you know, high performance M cars, you know, like the M5 or the M3, where they had sort of an integrated, it wasn't a dedicated dry sump system. And as a result, a lot of these cars, people would take them to the track, put sticky rubbers on them, and all of a sudden they'd risk blowing up their engine simply because there was pulling too many G's in the corner with race rubber. As a matter of fact, they would void warranty as soon as you put some race rubber on these cars, because they knew the G's would be pulling, and they knew that there was a huge risk for these engines to go boom. So there was a lot of the experts came out after the fact and said, well, you know what, let's put some baffles in there. The baffles can resist that sloshing of the oil and hopefully can keep the oil where it's needed and get the oil away quicker and get that new supply going in there. See, so of course there's always these little groups, these little third-party operations that are able to find out solutions. But okay, that was one of the problems. Then it came another issue, a big issue. All of a sudden there were some engines that were failing. How was that failing? Well, low mileage, all of a sudden, lo and behold, they'd have some rattling noises, some clunk, clunk, bang, and the engine would die. Well, a lot of that led to what we know today is the intermediate shaft bearing problem. That's right, there's a bearing tucked in tightly between the engine and the gearbox called the IMS, or the IMS bearing, and everybody knows about this for now. And see, it wasn't really an issue because it was a different arrangement back in the 993, and it was even a different arrangement in what came later than this was the 996 Turbo, which was using still an old GT1 style engine. See, a lot of people believe that the 996 Turbo is the same engine or the same car as a 996 Carrera, and it's absolutely not. See, the Turbo was an entirely different engine, what they call the Metzger engine. It was sort of left over what they call the GT1 split case, a proper 911 race engine. It had the durability, the performance, the output. You could tune it, and it could tolerate a lot of boost. So for people looking at getting into a 996, the turbos, even though their value sort of hampered a little bit because of the association with the 996 moniker, the fact remains is the Turbo is in fact an entirely different car. Now the Turbo had problems with, you know, you get overzealous people shifting their gears, pulling gears too hard. Next thing you know, you're crunching gears, and so synchronizers in the gearbox were a weak point. As were cooling system, there were still leaks, and you know, there's repair shops that do a good job now of, you know, welding up these coolant pipes so they won't leak anymore. They had this aluminum pipe that would spread and start to leak. There was also problems with the up and down wing and the hydraulics, but I mean, barring no few of those problems, it was a very robust car. The 996 Turbo is actually very well sought after, and the prices are starting to skyrocket on those. But where does that leave this car? Where does that leave a Carrera 996 with the M96 engine? Well, the fact is, it's still sort of, you know, it's that unwanted sheep of the family, if you will, in the sense that, you know, it still has that integrated dry sump. You have IMS issues. You have rear main seal issues. A lot of the problems with these, of course, came mechanically in other areas. The air and oil separator, not an uncommon part. And if you've ever had a look at one, you can't get at it. You pretty much got to either disassemble the entire top of the engine or pull the engine out altogether, or the gearbox and the engine, or a combination thereof. And it's really not an easy engine to work on when you have any major failures or any major issues. But you see, that's the problem. Herein lies issues like we're finding with air and oil separator. A lot of people found cracked heads. As a result, they mildly overheat an engine one time, maybe because of a bad water pump or some other issue, or they leak coolant and they didn't watch the gauge, and lo and behold, all of a sudden they have a situation where they overheated the engine a little bit, went a little too high. Well, there was also prevalence for these engines and the heads to crack, fissures, small cracks you maybe didn't see, but that sometimes led into oil and coolant mixing. Well, you know what happens when you start pouring a bunch of coolant into the oil? It starts to chew away at the bottom end. It can literally wipe out your engine in a heartbeat. On top of it, it eats up gaskets and cooling lines and you name it. It's never a good combination. But cracked heads was a common factor, common issue. Timing chains, chain tensioners, chain tensioner guides. These were all common issues. Air and oil separators. Bore scoring was another problem that came in later. A lot of people said, you know what, they had problems more in the later 3.6s, and as you transition even into the early generation of the 997s, like the generation 1, say the 2005, everybody thought, hey, I'm lucky, I got a 997, but guess what? You're not out of the woods yet either, because the 997 was essentially an extension of the same M96 engine with some final, you know, some updates, some improvements, some enhancements. But the IMS bearing was still a bit of an issue, as was bore scoring now. So you had to watch out for oil burning. Bore scoring could lead to reduced compression ratio and a whole lot of other problems. So the M96 engine and the 996 engine were unfortunately just a bit of a problem child, and it has been since day one. But here's the beauty in the learning. You know, if we can't learn a little something along the way, then what good is life, right? So part of the issue as well, other than just the repairs that, you know, you had to deal with, and you know, a lot of the tuners and the aftermarket shops know how to fix some of these problems. Intermediate shaft bearing, there's improvements now. They've got better bearings. They have oil fed bearing systems that are aftermarket. They have these other bearings, these upgraded bearings, either dual row or something that represents the later model, or even ceramic type bearings. So they've got enhancements. The IMS, once you've had it done, it generally isn't a problem. So if you're buying one of these cars, the best thing you can do is make sure the previous owner has addressed the IMS, that it's got a good aftermarket upgrade, and that it's got a new clutch. Make sure you do the rear main seal while you're in there, because that's also another potential failure point. Not that that's generally catastrophic, but while you're in there, you might as well take care of the, you know, the rear main seal, fix your IMS bearing, and then Bob's your uncle. Well, so while you're in there, you might as well put a new air and oil separator in there, change a few of your hoses, and then you're good for another 100,000 miles. These engines actually were pretty robust overall, but they had their weaknesses, and that's a big part of it. So then you ask, okay, if there's all these solutions for these third parties to build these better and enhanced parts, some people said, you know what, IMS isn't an issue if you drive your car. There's a lot of people that are out there wagging and bagging their 996s and auto-crossing them and running the wheels off them, and they've never had a problem. And a lot of them are 150,000 miles and beyond. How is that? Well, some of the learnings are, they say a lot of the engines that were failing were engines that sat too long. So the bearings tend to leak out. The original bearings were light duty. They weren't built as well. Plus they had the face. It was a sealed bearing. They would leak out their ooze and their juice, and basically then they would dry out. And if they sat there, then the bearing wouldn't have a chance to stay under oil and wouldn't stay lubricated. That in itself would cause a problem. Okay, fine. Now there's these improved IMSs. These third-party shops know how to fix these cars. So what's the problem? Why are the values not where the rest of the lineup was? Like the 993s, really coveted and highly sought after. Same with the 997s, they're creeping up in value. Well, herein lies the other part of this. See, after the 996 came out, many people thought, you know what, that's not a great design. Don't love the look. They had what they call a slab side. You know, the overall sides of the body was really more of just a flat fixture. It didn't have the flare that you saw it from the 993s. So it didn't have those nice sculpted hips. It was more of a straight body, and honestly, you can attest it to feeling a little bit more like a Toyota Camry. As a matter of fact, the first drive I was offered by a local sales guy that said, here's a key, why don't you go try it? When this car first came out, I tried one out, and my first thought was, this car feels almost too refined. Coming from an air-cooled 911, these felt very refined, almost too smooth, and actually just lacked that rough and aggressive and abrasive feel that you quite often had with some of the older 911s. So herein lies this feel. It didn't have the old school feel. But then on top of it, a big part of it was not just the slab side, not just the enhanced driving experience and the fact that it felt too refined. Lo and behold, there was other issues, and other issues related to the headlights. And I hate to be that, it seems like such a minor thing, but let's face it, the 911 enthusiast is one of the stickiest, fussiest, loyalist car lover and enthusiast you can possibly imagine or dream of. And because of that, they like what they like. And then this is the first time Porsche came out with a new headlight. This new headlight up until that point, they've always been known as sort of the bug eyes. You know, that the little round bug eyes. It didn't matter if you're looking at a 1969, 79, 89, 90, well, not 99, 96, 97. They all had that round headlight. I mean, different configurations. They sort of transitioned to a smoother look, and you know, they went from, you know, a little incandescent light bulb effectively to something that was a little bit more broad, brighter. But they all kind of had that look, design, that style that, you know, that was pretty consistent. And then all of a sudden, they came out in all their infinite wisdom. Porsche decided they were going to put these, what they call the fried egg or burnt egg or whatever, headlights that really strongly resembled the GT1 race car. Now, some people hate on it, and that was a big part of it, the drawback. I personally love the 991 headlights, or the GT1 headlights that are on the 996. And if you go Google, check it out, the GT1 headlights in the race car were the exact same headlights. So you'd say, okay, what's wrong with that? Really nothing. But again, the enthusiasts like what they like. And because it was such a deviation between the fried egg headlights, the you know, the narrow body, the liquid cooling, and then of course up and coming reliability challenges meant that it just didn't sit well with a lot of enthusiasts. And it realistically, it's sad because it's still well loved, you know, for autocrossers and people that actually like to use them. And from the driver's seat where I'm sitting right now, it's an absolute lovely and a gem of a car. So what's going to happen with these cars, and what do you think is going to happen with the value of a 996? Well, long and short of it, these will never be collector car. They were produced in high numbers, high volumes. The reliability challenges, even though they're fixable, the style, the design, some people try to put these stickovers that try to cover that headlight and make it look like more of a round headlight. You really can't fake it. I mean, even when you try that, you can still tell it's fake. But ultimately, there's too many of these on the road. That being said, those that really appreciate them. And the fact remains is, what we're starting to see are values in fact creeping up on the Carreras too. Now the cars that really are leading the way, of course, are the turbos, the 996 turbos. I've driven that. A good friend of mine, Ed, best mechanic here in Alberta, that works on Porsches. He knows these cars inside, up and down. And he had one for many years. And basically, he had a 996 turbo, which coincidentally was one of, if you remember Kevin Lowe, ex-hockey player from the Edmonton Oilers, it was his car. He sold it then to Ed, and Ed tuned it up to something 600-700 ponies. That thing was absolutely on destruction mode. But then what ended up happening was there was a bad collision. He was on the receiving end. Unfortunately, Ed's car was written off, and we had to say bye-bye to that. But before we did, I drove that car, and it was absolutely spectacular. The 996 turbo is one of the best, and those values continue to climb, and they will continue to climb. I don't see them going anywhere from here, but other than up. And then, of course, the next ones are the Carrera 4S, which are an all-wheel drive version. They utilized what they saw as the turbo engine, or the turbo bodywork, the brakes, a lot of the suspension, but they put the naturally aspirated engine. Now, because of the looks, the style, the lower production numbers, those cars are actually holding a pretty good value and are starting to creep up. And people that know what they are, if you know, you know, as they say. Then, of course, the next ones that are going to continue going up are, you know, C2 manual coupes. Those are the next cars, the simpler cars, the GT3s. Any of these, even though they weren't necessarily the best of the breed, they're all going to start creeping up. You know, coupes, manuals are always going to hold a better value. Cabrios are always going to do worse. You know, Targas are never really that great of a value retainer, but what you are starting to see are the 996 values starting to creep up. And it's good to know that there are solutions for some of the mechanical woes. And the body style is really starting to grow. And honestly, as we see the prices of some of these newer generation 911s creep up, what do you think that's going to do for these older cars, these 996s? They have nowhere to go but up. They're not going to be the first cars most people are thinking about. But if you only have 40 grand to spend and you can't get into a 997, what's your options? Well, you're going to look at a 996 and you're going to say, well, I'll concede It's good enough. It'll do everything that I need it to, and it feels an awful lot like a 991. So this is exactly what people are doing, and this is what we did, and we got ourselves into effectively a 996 C2 Cabriolet because, well, we wanted a convertible. It was very specific about that requirement for us, and it had to be a manual because we still wanted the engaging driving experience. So we ended up buying a manual Cabriolet, and of course rear-wheel drive. It's the rawest driving extension of the experience that you could possibly imagine. So long and short of it, there's a whole pile of reasons why used Porsche 996s are so cheap. But I truly also believe in the fact that those days are numbered. And as time goes on and there's less of these on the road and prices of all of the so-called superior 911 models go up, these will go up too. Mark my words. Again, as always, everybody, I hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll talk to you all real soon. Thanks again so much. Catch you then. Bye-bye.